Hello and greetings to my YouTube family. I continue to say how much I appreciate the time you take to critique the postings of these videos, the feedback you send to me, the congratulatory messages, as well as your suggestions and recommendations for any improvement that I can make. Today, in this episode of Time of Reckoning, I want to use the opportunity to pay tribute to the Cuban government and the Cuban people. We commonly refer to it as a Cuban Revolution. Most times, people talk about Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban governments and authorities. And I say governments meaning successive leaders of the administration of Cuba. People tend to feel that you are a communist, you are a rebel, you don't like freedom, and all of those things. But I will begin by shedding a little light on some of the reasons why many of us children of resistance tend to pay homage and love for movements of resistance and struggles. There was a time when the only side that the people who were oppressed could side with or could take were movements that were sympathetic to the cause of their struggles. If you reflect a bit back in the 1950s, the 1940s, the 1930s, all those years, and the further back you go, it's the more true the reality is that post-slave societies were under immense pressure and oppression from their former enslavers. People commonly refer to them as the slave masters. Yes, they were enslavers. And the people they held in bondage were not slaves, but they were the enslaved. So, just imagine, a slave could not look for help from the enslaver or from the slave master. They have to try and find help and try and find whatever encouragement they can get from any person or group that were not siding with the slave master, the enslaver, and the oppressor. So when we take it close now to modern times, close to the time when many of the societies, for example, in the Caribbean, were quote unquote inching toward their freedom, their independence. They were struggling. Caribbean resistant movement that later came to form what we call Caribbean governments, who became the leaders of the independence movement and later those who became prime ministers of the independent countries of the regions. Just think about it. There were many of them fighting the British, or you would say negotiating with the British, the independence. And there were hard struggles, yeah? There were hard struggles. But there were people who were against slavery, against colonialism, and against holding nation states in the bondage of colonization, holding nation states as colonies. There were people like that. So obviously, if a nation state is resisting colonization and want to be independent, it's obvious that their friends are not going to be the colonizers. Their friends are going to be those who are against colonization and freedom for the colonized. As a consequence of that, many of the nation states that were pursuing decolonization, pursuing independence, pursuing a free nation state, these people found a lot of encouragement in nation states around the world that were resistant to those very things as well. And so many of those nations were communist nations. Yes, they were communist nations. And so they found a lot of solace, a lot of camaraderie, a lot of encouragement coming from those nations that were communist nations, nations that were resisting the very same thing that they're now trying to rid themselves of. As a consequence of that, many of the nation states in the Caribbean have an alignment with the state of Cuba that caused many of the first world countries to be a bit uncomfortable. Now, since COVID 19, the governments of the Caribbean have benefited tremendously from medical expertise of the Cuban government. The government of Jamaica have scores of Cuban doctors and nurses and specialists in the island of Jamaica, Barbados also, and other Caribbean islands have asked and received help from the Cuban government. And it is for that reason I want to really pay a special tribute to the government of Cuba and to the Cuban Revolution. Because you see, it is true that many of the people in the Caribbean who are looking for economic help will run to places like England, Canada, the United States, and other so-called first world countries. And the simple reason for that is because the criminal money that they have acquired over centuries, having slave labor, have made them awash with money. And so people who want money go where money is. But it is interesting to note that in a crisis, we never are able to call upon these first world countries to get help with things like nurses and doctors. But Cuba does provide them. And it's not only in the Caribbean, but there are thousands of medical doctors and nurses, people who specialize in all different areas of specialties, are in Africa and other so-called third world countries of the world, countries that are made poor and pauperized by first world countries, primarily by Britain. And we can't call on Britain to give us 100 nurses and doctors in this time of COVID crisis. They don't have it. They don't even have enough to take care of their own people. But Cuba does. And Cuba does provide them. You know, some time ago, I watched an interview with medical students from the Caribbean who go to study in Cuba to become medical doctors, to come back to help shore up the medical fraternity in the Caribbean. And the guy who was doing the interview is an American. And you know what? There were students from America, from the United States of America, that were in Cuba, also being trained to become doctors. And I say that with pride because the training is free to the students, you know. This training is free to the students. And those persons who know and are not prejudiced and biased know that Cuba produced some of the best doctors in the world. Cuba produced some of the best doctors in the world. And because of the wicked embargo imposed upon Cuba by the United States, that great imperial power, Cuba is forced to develop their own medicine, their own vaccines. By the way, Cuba has one of the lowest AIDS rate in the whole world. And now with COVID-19, Cuba is now on par with any first world country in testing vaccines, third stage testing of their vaccines to help cure this raging and ravaging coronavirus. So one has to pay respect to the island of Cuba and the revolution that led to it being what it is. Barbados is now much more comfortable in their effort to deal with COVID 19 because of the scores of doctors. The first set came was over 100, and since then there have been many more, you know, and it enables the island of Barbados, a small island developing state, as Kofi Annan says, that the nation state of Barbados punches above its weight. Barbados is indeed a very powerful little nation, but it was never prepared for COVID 19. Like many other countries in the world, the United States wasn't prepared for it, you know. And it is interesting to note that China, where the virus originated, well, they say, has dealt effectively with coronavirus without a vaccine. Yes, they now have vaccines too, but the effectiveness of their dealing with it before a vaccine was possible is amazing. You know, they have far more people than the United States, but they also have far more discipline. So they were able to contain the virus in Wuhan and prevent it from spreading to other provinces. But the kind of carefree country that the United States is, we know that it is so difficult to control people with all the freedom that they claim to have. And so it is ravaging that country more than it is doing anywhere else on earth. That is almost unbelievable, but that is true. That is true, you know. So little Cuba, you know, our friend in, we would almost say in the Caribbean. We know it's not in the Caribbean, but, you know, it's just like Guyana. Guyana is in South America, but, you know, Guyana is almost like a Caribbean country, does everything with the Caribbean. And so Cuba, we adopt Cuba as a Caribbean state. And it has done so much for us. You know, some of the money that those slave owning countries of the world, England, the United States of America, France, Germany, you know, these countries that rape countries of the world, thief the resources of countries of the world, they gave back a little bit in terms of what they call grants. You can imagine, they thief the resources of these countries and then give you back pittance and call it grant. But when we are in trouble, when we have problems requiring real help in terms of disease, you know, we have to find real money to access help from those sources. But Cuba came to our aid all the time, not just now. From time immemorial, I can recall doctors from Cuba operating on the island of Jamaica. You know, I can still remember with great disgust the elections of 1980, October of 1980, when Edward Seaga won that election and gave the Cuban doctors on the island of Jamaica and their ambassador and all those persons who work in their embassy 24 hours to leave the island of Jamaica. And so much to the hurt of many Jamaicans who came to love so much the Cubans, Cubans left. But I live to see the same party led by Edward Seaga, the Jamaica Labour Party, now depending heavily on Cuba for assistance in their fight against COVID-19. Not to mention, even before COVID, the tremendous help and dependency the Jamaica Labour Party shows on Cuba for helping with eye surgery for the people of Jamaica. So to Cuba, we say kudos. We are indebted to Cuba and its people for the many scholarships that they have given to Caribbean children who could not otherwise have attained a medical degree. Because we know to become doctors and lawyers are the two most expensive training, for people in the Caribbean, if not the world. And many of the poor people in the Caribbean who are farmers, domestic helpers, many of their children who are brilliant could not access those care. Michael Manley tried when he wanted education to be free in Jamaica. Again, thanks to Edward Seaga, that program was squashed. And so, certain tertiary level of training in Jamaica is only for the privileged few. For the privileged few. On the island of Barbados, where education remains free, there are more PhD holders per capita than most parts of the world. That includes Canada and the United States. Why? Because education is free. A child in Jamaica who leaves school with 4 and 5 CXCs at grade 1, after 3 or 4 years leaving school, a Jamaican child might have a bachelor's degree, which is the first and most simple degree you can get at the University of the West Indies. But at the same time, those same 4 years, the Barbadian child will already have a master's degree and now planning to go on to PhD. Why? Because it's free to them. So kudos to the government of Barbados as well for continuing to shouldering the burden of free education for the people. The government of Cuba have learned that secret aeons ago. And so they have more doctors per capita than any country anywhere on planet Earth. So much so that whenever the occasions arise, they can send scores of doctors to the far-flung corners of the earth to help. So my hat's off to Cuba. Thanks so much for watching. Please remember to leave a comment in the comment section right there below where you watch this video. If you have not yet done so, please subscribe to this channel. And you can also click the notification button so that when another video is uploaded, you will get it even without me having to send it to you directly. Until then, have a good day, a blessed day. Bye-bye now.